numbers here, can we please have a gentleman, ladies, whatever you call it, agreement, that when I write numbers, I mean density. So I just don't want to always write number per unit area because I'm lazy. Three populations, A, B, and C, which is the dots, okay? And we notice that they vary between 0 and some upper limit. And through time, the numbers change. Some species, like species B, don't show a lot of change over time. Others, like species A and C, show huge variability. And one peculiar thing about species A is it varied so much that it went to 0. That from this high, right here, it underwent a massive loss in numbers all the way down to where there aren't any left. And you'll notice there's no line for it past that point. Okay? Imagine two population densities. That's what these are, right? We had that agreement. One's a lower line, one's an upper line. You guys already know about the lower line. The lower line that I've drawn is called the lower extinction limit. What does it mean? It means that if a density is so low it hits that line, it's going to go to extinction because there are too few individuals. For a sexual species, you know that if the line is 1, they're going to extinction because you don't have both required sexes. But as a practical matter, you know if there's only 2 individuals left of a species, they're not going to make it. If we look at individual populations rather than species, we can study a population and see that they routinely go to extinction. Not all populations survive through time. Lots of them go to extinction. So if we were looking at, and it's not just true of animals, if we were looking at daisy populations in a field over a long time and we defined an arena as a population, this set of daisies or this set of whatever plant we look, we would see the numbers would differ through time and maybe they'd continue and be stable and sustained, but some of the places we study, they're going to disappear and die out. Will you remember that? Because I'm going to come back and make an important point about it. What's the upper line? That's the upper extinction limit. It says that when densities reach a certain level, the population will inevitably go to 0. And it's counterintuitive. This is the greatest number of undergrads I've ever seen in my life. And then next year there are 0. How could that happen? I've heard some of you in the class already say you know why it happens, but let's look at it in detail. What would cause a species to be occurring in massive, massive numbers, and yet reach a certain high level, and all of a sudden it goes to 0? It's what somebody said here just a moment ago. It runs out of resources. But it's not just that it runs out of resources. It's that it so overstrips its resources, no single individual can even survive. Do we see, if we actually make measurements in the field, do we actually see species that exceed the upper extinction coefficient? Yes, we do. We don't see it so much as a species, but we see it in individual populations. Which implies then that over the long term, if you get into this region or in this region, you're going to die. We all know that if you die and everybody dies, that's pretty much selection where there's There's no sex, there's no babies, there's no grandchildren, it's all over. So we would expect that evolution would operate to prevent individuals from moving into these arenas. Now let me be very careful in what I say, which was not the case of people studying this. Populations do not evolve. Individuals evolve. Selection operates on individuals, not on populations. We can see changes in gene frequency in a population because of selection on the individuals in there, but don't make the mistake of thinking that, oh, the population, as if it were a single thing, is evolving to do this or that. No, selection is operating on individuals within the population, and in the group, something happens. We're going to come on this issue over and over again, so I may as well tackle it now. This is an aside, okay? So here's the aside. I made mention of it in an earlier lecture, but I didn't make a big deal out of it, so I don't think you guys probably focused on it. Do you recall that when I was talking about oxygen, development of multicellular growth, I pointed out that as soon as these individual cells started to combine into single organisms, things that had been separate suddenly became one. And so what we talk about as a single thing, a single organism, is in very much reality a group of organisms, all the way down even to our individual cells, which have ribosomes and mitochondria, which were one time pre-living organisms. We are our own population. We are a colony. We're not a single thing. Even though we talk about ourselves, we talk about individuals as if they were a single thing. That turns out to be a pretty significant issue in ecology, because I just did this harangue about populations are not the unit of selection. When we look at social species, there is strong evidence that populations are the unit of selection. It remains controversial, but I really don't think it should be, because the evidence is quite overwhelming. I'm not going to go into it now, because we'll have a whole lecture on it. But what I want you to carry away from this is, it's not trivial to talk about individuals versus population and what's being selected, okay? As human beings, we have a big problem with another concept. And I'm going to call this the Borg dilemma. I assume most of you have seen at least one of the Star Trek movies that feature the Borg, or at least familiar with it. The idea of the Borg is supposed to be, they take different species, it's sort of like a machine. Different species from around, it comes, it attacks, it absorbs all those individuals, and they become part of a single collective mind. And so the Borg, which is a giant block, you wouldn't think with all those minds, they could have had a little aesthetics. Come on, man, the Borg, look, I don't know, they're not doing it for me, man. Put fins on their feet or something. Give me something. Okay, so I watch one of these movies, and I see that there's a Borg commander. And I freak out in my movie chair. Why? There can't be. You can't have a collective consciousness and then say, but one consciousness of a part is more than the other. There's no single cell in your brain that is you. It's the combination of those brain cells that is you. And I'll go one further. We're not even sure what you is. And that's grammatically correct. That is awesome that I can make the same. We're not sure what you is. I think you put you in a quotation marks. To our best understanding at this point, the concept of self arises through some minimum number of neural pathways. That once a brain has a sufficient number of individual nerves, the individual, I'm not saying it has consciousness, but I am saying it has some understanding of self. Since I started teaching, this is another thing I've talked about and I've been disappointed over. I remember saying specifically that by 2015, I'm pretty sure that we would have a mechanistic understanding of self, which would be the same thing as knowing what the physical basis is of consciousness. And I said, and there's going to be a lot of religious people who are very unhappy with that discovery. If you think the whole sun around the moon, Earth rotating around the sun thing was big, you don't know what controversy is like as soon as somebody says they can create, they know what the physical basis is of consciousness. Because for human beings, we equate our ability to be conscious and have self with the concept of soul. This is also why good science fiction writers, and there are a few of them, when they take up the question, the real question of can machines evolve consciousness, what they're really saying is, what happens if we see that we can create a machine that in terms of its understanding is the same as our own? What would that mean with respect to being human? You'll see this issue come up many times. You see it with respect to animal rights issues. This week, it became illegal to kill lobsters in Switzerland by boiling them. And there's a bill for the same thing in France. Why? Because there is a conviction, at least among the Swiss, that they can perceive pain and it's inhumane. I wish I could spend the time talking about this with you, but I guess if you take my advanced conservation biology, you'll be sick of our talking about it. But it turns out the ability to perceive pain is a really, really big deal in terms of how human beings try to rank species and try to understand species. And there's essentially a theory that the more a species can perceive pain, the higher its level of consciousness. And unfortunately, when you get to some of the primates, particularly chimpanzees, you begin to ask very serious questions about, is there a meaningful distinction in terms of what their rights should be versus what human rights should be? And that too, there's a lot of evidence, and it can make you uncomfortable. And that's a sign there's an ethical dilemma, so that's a good thing. Now, why am I talking about this? For this reason. Because we operate as individuals as if we have centralized control, that our brain says what we're doing, we assume that's how other systems operate. We literally have huge difficulty in conceiving of things that operate without an architect or without purpose or without direction. And yet when we look at nature, we see this constantly. And it's a big point of frisson. Do you have that word, frisson? It means, it's like friction, but it's different. If you want to say friction, I never get to say the word frisson in conversation. I'm quite proud of that. I'm not Big McGilla proud, but I'm pretty proud. Okay. I want you to try to just understand this, and it applies here. Don't let yourself be misled down the path of thinking that evolution is operating in such a way that it's leading to some direction. It doesn't lead anywhere. All evolution is a heartless name for the phenomenon that you live or die, you have sex or die, you have your offspring produced or you don't have them produced. The most fit individuals are not alive right now. How do I know that? Because there's been 4 major extinction events, and whether you lived or died was purely a matter of luck. The historical record shows that we do not have the best adapted species today. We just have a bunch of species that are damn lucky. And that definitely includes human beings. Okay. What does all this have to do with population regulation? If you use the word regulation, there's the implication that populations somehow change their numbers in association with other populations. And I'm saying that is not possible. Oh, the population's getting really high now, so I guess I'll commit suicide because that'll be good for the group. Okay, yeah, you won't reach the extinction limit, but the genes that would lead you to commit suicide are going to go away, which means that you'd be likely to have more selfish genes in the population, you'll go up. So that doesn't make sense. Do you understand what I'm driving at? So what people call regulation here is a much more complex thing. There's no regulation, but somehow evolution on the individuals and populations of all kinds have led to traits that prevent them from getting too high or too low. Let's think about an example of these. Right now, past 3 weeks, some of you guys know Braymond Adams, who's one of my grad students because he's a TA in other courses. Bray's doing some research with these beetles, and he's having trouble getting the research working. And it's because of the phenomenon of upper extinction limits. What's happening with Bray's beetle? And I'll tell you this, it's not that Bray has beetles in very high densities that are getting to upper extinction limits. It's that they involve a certain behavior that will come into play at upper extinction limits that's really screwing his work up. What I want you to do is guess what that behavior is. What would be a behavior that might evolve when you get really high densities? Pardon?
Just won't reproduce.
That's it. That's right. You could have, but it couldn't be completely do that because you'd lose the genes, right? You could have reduced reproduction, but not higher. On the other hand, if somebody has high reproduction, maybe they're going to cheat. So there must be limits to that. But you're on the right track. Okay, there's one. It could happen. You do see changes in reproduction based on density. That can also happen. In this case, it's not. And you guys, and I want to say I'm disappointed in you, are not sufficiently evil. Would you please embrace your inner evil and think what's really going on here?
Eat each other.
Damn straight, they go cannibalistic. His beetles are eating each other like crazy, and I just want to slap the little bastards. Come on, stay alive. Don't be that guy who eats his brother and sister. We can take species, lots of different animal species, and if we put them at very high density, they will become cannibalistic. And I'm not just talking about insects. You can see this with rats and mice and a variety of things. Why? Because at high densities, they're going to be competition for food, and so there would be selection for more aggressive behaviors, even at the point of cannibalism, which is the most aggressive behavior you can have. The way people spoke about this was to say, they talked about it in terms of forces. That here there should be forces to drive the population down, and here there should be evolutions of forces that drive the population up.
Can't you feed them enough that they stop eating each other?
No. And that's the interesting phenomenon. It started because of a food shortage, but the behavior itself is triggered merely by density, not by food. Varies by species. You can do this with lots of caterpillars that are plant eaters, and they'll switch right over and start eating each other. With certain species, this happens in mammals. You'll see, particularly with predaceous mammals, that the males will start killing offspring, even sometimes, as bizarre as it is, killing females to reduce the numbers. Because if the total numbers are down, their chance of getting a mate and surviving is better, presumably. What's the reverse? How do behaviors or biology change at low levels? Well, the reproduction thing is a perfect one. Do you have situations where the reproduction is much higher at low densities? Absolutely you do. There's two ways that could happen. One is just, hey, if there's more food, I can produce more eggs. But there are also physiological changes. You might, for example, find at low densities, the likelihood for a female to remain monogamous decreases. We can see that, I believe we see that in birds, and I know we see it in some mammals, and we definitely can see it in certain insects, who, let's face it, aren't that faithful to the beginning. All of these things I talked about are intrinsic to the species. What about outside the species? And this is where the debate started. So, let me get back on track here after my sons. Essentially, in the 1930s, there were a series of experiments done by a biologist, Australian biologist named Nicholson. And he took Rucilia sericata and started rearing them in cages. We have the very same insect in cages in my lab. It's a blowfly, okay? I know you can't see it. I know. Just give me a sec. Okay? And he started manipulating the amount of food. So he put different amounts of food in. And what he discovered is that over time, he could get stable populations. And what he further discovered is that There were changes in the competition among the individuals. He could see evidence of cannibalism and so forth. And his argument was that at very high population densities, populations will always have a tendency to come down because of a single factor: intraspecific competition, competition within the species. We've not talked about this. We will when I talk about competition, but you get the idea, right? If there's more people, you're going to fight more for that parking space. You're going to fight more for the chair in the room. Same thing that Nicholson found. And what was amazing, that he could keep these populations on low diets going for a very long time, albeit at a lower level. So he said, look, how much those insects fight is dependent on how many there are, on their density. And you know what? It's the same with predators. If there's more prey, the predators will take more of that prey. And it also can be true of disease, that if there's more individuals, the likelihood of disease is greater. Therefore, the reason populations remain between these two limits is because of a whole variety of density-dependent factors. And the key word there is density-dependent. Whew, problem solved. Man, that's great. Glad we got that out of the way. We can move on to more interesting questions. Except that two biologists, also in Australia, had spent a lot of time working not on these blowflies, but on thrips. Tiny little weird-ass insect that scrapes for its food, has little feathery wings, transmits a lot of viruses, and they got a lot of data. The guys involved were called Andwortha and Birch. They published this wonderful book in the 50s, Study of Animal Populations, where they used insects as a model. And they said, in scientific speech, look, density dependence is bullshit. It's not density dependence that sets, and from our field data, not obscure lab data, we can tell you that it's whether it's hot or cold and how much rain. The environment sets those limits, and so populations are regulated by density independent factors, because the size of the population does not determine how much rain falls or how hot it is or anything else. And there was then a 50-year fight over which of the two theories was right. A fight so overlasting that, as I said, as late as 2000, and to a lesser extent today, there are still people who fight over it. I think the entire thing was answered in 1960. I'm kind of following the lead of my advisor when he taught about this. But there was a group of ecologists from Australia. I don't know what got into the I don't know what they were drinking. I think the beer was different back in the 50s in Australia. They drink a lot, but there had to be something. By the way, I was early in my career, I was at a conference in Thailand, and as it happens, I don't drink. And I discovered the surest way to make friends with Australians is to be someplace where they're serving you gobs and gobs of beer and say you don't drink. Those guys loved me. They couldn't wait to get close to me so they could drink their beers and all of my beers. I've never seen a people consume beer the way the Australians consumed beer that night. I should have documented it. It was a biological phenomenon. But I digress. This paper, for some reason, didn't get this book, I should say. There were a group of ecologists, Geigers, Clark, Hughes, and Morris, who wrote a book. And what they were really writing a book about was insect control. But they made some observations that I think explain this whole thing. And that's what I'm going to share with you as an explanation for what's really going on. And then I'll give you some additional documentation. And here was their insight. When you think about the physical environment, sets where these lines are. Look, if conditions are really favorable for a species, well, then they can survive at higher numbers. So it's not true that there's a set level, that where these lines are is set by the environment. It's going to vary by year. Maybe it's going to vary within a year, but it's not a constant. And that's the key role of density-independent factors. They determine the arena in which populations can vary. Within those limits, the forces that are causing things to go up and down are largely driven by density-dependent factors. So that if the population is super high, there'll be increasing forces that cause mortality. And if it's super low, those mortalities are less likely and you come up. The first part is that the environment sets the limits for a population. And that within those limits, how a population changes is largely driven by density-independent factors. As I've read information, in fact, there's a quote I want to read from this paper on population regulation at the end. That sort of summarizes a modern view. I am convinced that the convergence between the Nicholson and Antwertha schools is occurring largely because, largely as a result of the actual experience of analyzing data back and forth and thinking very hard about what the results were. Do you recall in an early lecture I said that I disagree about how people present the history of science? My view of science is everything is driven by data. You try to explain what you actually observed or what you actually got. And I think this is a good debate that explains the danger of not doing that. With limited data sets, people try to make huge sweeping theories. And people are fighting. But the truth is, if they've gotten more data, those problems resolve themselves because you can see what's happening. Moreover, these two things were never actually in opposition. They were presented as if it could only be one or the other, instead of looking at where the two married. So I think Geyer, Clark, Hughes, and Morris, that's a mouthful, got it right as far back as 60, even before all the data were there. They had the independence, I guess, to realize that this was not an either-or situation. It was an under which circumstances, how do these things interact together? I would like to pause and reflect upon how this applies to other areas of human controversy that are always presented as if it's either this or that, and the reality is rarely that case. But let me limit my comments to science. This problem happens over and over and over and over again in science. And it's because people are jerks. You cannot remove the influence of personality in our own human nature from this process, but we need to. And time and again, what we find when we look at things is, when there's sufficient data, people aren't going to disagree because you have to explain what the data mean. It's only when we don't have data that you have a tendency to see these sort of venomous debates occupy science. We're going to return to this for the rest of the course. Why? We'll have a lecture on predation. What is predation? It's one of these density-dependent factors that force populations down. Same for disease. Same for competition. So in a sense, that diagram sets sort of a stage for us thinking about pretty much everything else I'm going to lecture on, or we'll discuss when it comes to populations. I'll repeat this on Monday, but for God's sakes, make sure you understand this, because I'm going to expect you to. And if it's true that the agronomists or what have you are in the back row, that chart turns out to be incredibly important for agriculture, because we can tweak it a little bit, and it tells us some very important things about when we need to worry about weeds, when we need to worry about diseases, when we need to do this or that, and when we don't. And it also points to theoretical ways we can reduce problems with a whole bunch of different species if we look at them ecologically, not just technologically. Whew, all right. Go forth and multiply, or whatever the appropriate thing is. Don't multiply. Stop. I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that. I'm going to edit that tape.
Yeah, it's actually.